The role of climate change in the Nepal floods. NPR says scientists were not surprised by the deadly Himalayan flash flooding because warmer temperatures are accelerating glacial melt and leaving more people exposed below steep valleys. Reuters carried a Fatal Floods newsletter, while Bloomberg asked what part warming played in the disaster. Counterfire described the event as an unnatural catastrophe, and Al Jazeera separately tracked what happened along the Nepal-Tibet border. The consequence is that rescue work is not the only public issue. Hazard mapping, evacuation zones, road rebuilding, and dam or bridge safety now become climate adaptation questions. Glacial lakes and saturated slopes can fail quickly, so warning time may be short even when regional forecasts are available. Communities need official counts, damaged route lists, and shelter information before they can judge whether homes are safe. The next records to watch are emergency management bulletins, updated casualty figures, and any scientific attribution review that separates rainfall, meltwater, terrain, and land use factors. Those updates will show whether this remains a disaster response or becomes a larger planning test for Himalayan governments. A longer record should also show whether river gauges, glacial lake monitoring, and local evacuation plans are being revised after the damage reports. If those systems are unchanged, the same warming-driven hazards can return before residents have stronger warning channels. Floods kill more than 400 people in Nepal and Tibet, with 90 Americans among the missing. Reuters puts the death toll in the hundreds and says more than 1,000 people are missing after the Himalayan flood. NPR reports 90 Americans among those still unaccounted for, and AP says the missing count is above 1,400. PBS also describes catastrophic damage, while Al Jazeera frames the question around who disappeared and what caused the flood. The immediate consequence is a multinational rescue and identification problem, not only a regional weather emergency. Foreign tourists, local families, guides, and village residents may be counted through different systems, which can make early numbers move sharply. Entire villages being swept away also means roads, communications, clinics, and bridges may be damaged just when search teams need them most. Watch for revised casualty lists, embassy updates, helicopter access reports, and statements from Nepalese and Chinese authorities on border area searches. The key public record is the next consolidated missing person list, because it will determine which families, governments, and rescue agencies still need urgent confirmation. Officials will also need to reconcile village-level reports with consular inquiries, because a tourist list can lag far behind a local rescue log. That matters for aid delivery, family notification, and deciding where aircraft, medical teams, and temporary bridges go first. Trump administration's blacklisting of Anthropic was illegal, judge rules. Reuters says a U.S. judge blocked the Pentagon action against Anthropic, and CNBC framed the dispute as a supply chain risk label. The New York Times, The Guardian, and Politico all report that the court found the government action unlawful. The core issue is whether defense officials followed the required process before placing an artificial intelligence company under a restrictive designation. For Anthropic, the consequence is access to federal contracting and reputational standing in a market where trust, security review, and procurement eligibility matter. For agencies, the ruling tests how far national security risk labels can go without a clear administrative record. The decision also matters for other technology vendors, because a blacklist can affect investors, customers, and partners before any final litigation ends. Watch for the written order, any Justice Department appeal, and Pentagon guidance explaining whether the label is removed, narrowed, or rebuilt through a new process. A later filing will show whether this is a one-company correction or a broader limit on how the government screens AI suppliers. The company will still face ordinary security review, but the ruling says that review must rest on process the court can examine. Contractors and rivals will watch whether future risk labels include fuller notice, evidence, and a chance to respond. Trump signs order renaming Lake Ontario as Lake America, escalating Canada feud. Reuters says the order arrives amid a Canada trade fight, while NPR reports that federal agencies were directed to use the new name. The Washington Post, AP, and Politico also track the order as a cross-border political dispute. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is reported elsewhere in the package saying the historic name will remain, which turns the issue into a sovereignty and diplomacy clash. The practical question is narrower than the rhetoric, which maps, databases, signs, and federal documents would actually change inside the United States. For Canada, the consequence is whether Ottawa treats the order as symbolic provocation or as part of a broader trade and border confrontation. For businesses and local governments, conflicting names can create confusion in tourism, shipping, environmental records, and emergency coordination. Watch for Canadian government statements, U.S. geographic names guidance, agency map updates, and any congressional or court challenge over naming authority. Those documents will show whether the order becomes operational policy or remains a political message in a larger bilateral feud. The dispute also arrives as trade tensions already give both governments incentives to signal toughness. If agencies change records while Canada refuses recognition, the same body of water could carry different official names in cross-border public documents. New Fed Chair Kevin Warsh under pressure to clarify views on inflation interest rates. The Washington Post and AP both describe pressure on Warsh to explain how he reads price risks and borrowing costs. Axios says the focus is his highly anticipated Jackson Hole speech, where investors will parse the message for clues. The issue is not a single rate move today. It is whether the new chair signals continuity, less guidance, or a more inflation-focused central bank. Inflation concern spreading beyond energy means households and businesses are watching credit card rates, mortgages, payroll costs, and savings yields. Markets also care about whether Warsh defends Fed independence while facing political expectations for easier money. The consequence is that vague language can move Treasury yields and stock valuations before any formal vote. Watch the speech text, the next policy statement, the vote split, and updated projections for evidence of how the committee is aligning behind him. If he stresses data dependence without a clear path, uncertainty may rise. If he names the conditions for a hold, cut, or hike, borrowers get a more usable signal. Small wording differences matter because traders may treat them as clues about how quickly policy could change. A chair who sounds uncertain about the inflation path can tighten financial conditions even without asking the committee to raise rates. Donald Trump Jr. told Republican state attorneys not to fight prediction markets, NY Times reports. CNBC says the president's son, an advisor to two platforms, urged Republican attorneys general to back off the industry. The New York Times frames the background as a furious clash between states and event contract companies, and the New Republic reports similar pressure on lawmakers. The conflict matters because Kalshi, Polymarket, and related venues turn elections, policy outcomes, and financial events into tradable contracts. State gambling regulators have challenged parts of that model, while federal commodity oversight may point in a different direction. The consequence is a regulatory boundary fight with political influence layered on top. If attorneys general withdraw, the platforms gain room to expand before courts or federal agencies settle the issue. If states keep fighting, the industry faces patchwork enforcement and more litigation. Watch for state enforcement notices, platform compliance changes, CFTC signals, and any disclosure clarifying Trump's advisory roles. Those records will show whether the reported pressure changes legal strategy or simply adds another political front to prediction market oversight. The named platforms also have different legal strategies, so one state settlement would not settle the entire sector. The durable checkpoint is a written regulatory enforcement action or federal order, not a private conversation described in campaign terms. 6 months into the Iran war, markets become accustomed to stalemate with no end in sight. CNBC says investors are adjusting to a drawn-out conflict, and Reuters describes U.S.-Iran fighting as energy trench warfare. National Security Journal reports that the world has burned through hundreds of millions of barrels of reserve oil since the fighting began. The package also notes that the war has outlasted the 4 to 6 week timetable the Trump administration expected for meeting its objectives. The consequence is that markets may stop reacting to every headline even while the underlying risk remains high. Oil reserves, shipping insurance, Gulf security, and military costs can all deteriorate slowly during a stalemate. Governments may also face pressure to explain whether their objectives are still achievable or have shifted toward containment. Watch for energy market closes, reserve release data, tanker advisories, military statements, and any diplomatic proposal from Washington, Tehran, or mediators. A renewed attack threat could reprice risk quickly, while a credible talks calendar would suggest the stalemate is changing shape. Until then, the key signal is whether routine market calm is masking deeper strategic strain. For consumers, that can appear later through fuel prices, freight costs, and government budget choices rather than through a dramatic one-day market shock. The longer the front stays frozen, the more those slow costs become policy pressure. Russia says it could strike UK military targets in response to Kiev's use of British missiles. Reuters reports the warning, and Al Jazeera says Moscow linked the threat to Ukraine firing British weapons. The Jerusalem Post notes that the Kremlin denied intent to attack NATO while still discussing potential UK-linked targets. The Times and other outlets in the package frame the story around British support for Kyiv and Russian retaliation language. The consequence is escalation risk for factories, bases, logistics sites, and alliance planning outside the immediate battlefield. Threats against a NATO member do not equal an attack, but they can force governments to review air defense, intelligence warnings, and protection for defense production sites. Kyiv's missile use also keeps the focus on how Western-supplied weapons are employed and what restrictions London places on them. Watch for statements from the British government, NATO, Ukraine, and the Kremlin, plus procurement or deployment notices tied to long-range missiles. The most important checkpoint is whether the warning is followed by new military action, a diplomatic protest, or clarified rules for Ukrainian strikes. That record will show whether this is deterrent rhetoric or a material widening of the war's geography. British officials also must judge whether public warnings protect deterrence or reveal sensitive plans. Defense factories, missile supply chains, and alliance consultations can become targets of pressure without a strike.